So I chose the recipe that we're making today based around the idea of using pantry ingredients to make nutritious meals. So this is something I talk about a lot, is having your kitchen well stocked. And that doesn't just mean with pantry ingredients, right? Not only dry foods and dry goods, but having your freezer well stocked, having having some longer lasting produce on hand, like onions, garlic, shallots, the kinds of produce that you use often, and that also last a while, so you don't have to worry about, they can be around for a couple weeks before they start to spoil at all. And also having your kitchen itself well stocked. So having your kitchen well equipped with the tools, utensils, and equipment that you need to make cooking easier, to make it more efficient. A lot of times some cooking task that feels very tedious or feels like a chore to you sometimes can be made easier just by having the right tool on hand. As we're going through this recipe here, I'll point out the staple ingredients, and we'll kind of just talk about how you can use what you have on hand to make getting a nutritious meal on the table a lot easier, and with some less like we talked about with meal planning, having your kitchen well stocked takes away some of the pressure of having to have every single meal planned for the week, because you know that you have some staple foods on hand that you can always rely on to throw together a nutritious meal. So our recipe today that we're cooking up is falafel. So this is really a simple recipe. It might seem like complicated to make homemade falafel, but it's actually really comes together quickly, especially because it relies almost entirely on these staple ingredients. So I'm using the word staple ingredients instead of just saying pantry ingredients, because like I said, it's not just what you have in your pantry. It's not just the canned goods and the jarred goods and the flour and all that stuff. It's also having fresh ingredients on hand that you use all the time, right? Or that you can always reach to add some flavor, or whatever you need to kind of add to make your dish whole. So the main ingredient in a traditional falafel is our chickpeas, right? So chickpeas or garbanzo beans, and I just use them in a can. So this falafel recipe, you just use canned chickpeas. I already have them from the can. I poured them into a colander and they are rinsed and drained. So that's the only thing with canned beans, is you do want to give them a good rinse. I always recommend, if you can, buy low sodium canned beans, because there's already extra sodium that goes into the canning process to preserve them. So if you get the low sodium, that cuts down on the salt a little bit. But we definitely want to rinse them when they come out of the can, and that will wash off some of that salt as well. And this is not just something to care about, if you need to be on a low salt diet. It's also that it will impact the flavor of the dish that you're making. So if you had chickpeas that were saltier, you would probably not want to use as much salt in the falafel recipe, if that makes sense. So canned beans is one of my ultimate essential pantry ingredients to have on hand. I have beans in all kinds of varieties of beans, and I use them at least a couple times a week. It just makes one of the easiest, it's one of the easiest protein sources, but the awesome thing about beans is they're not just protein, they're also starchy carbohydrate, they're fiber and protein. And it's a plant-based source of protein, which can be difficult for a lot of us to get more plant-based proteins in, and have something else to rely on that's not just animal protein. So I definitely recommend having all different varieties of beans on hand. There's a lot of different ways that you can use beans, which is something else about the falafel, right? So the falafel is kind of like a fun way to get beans in if you're not someone who really loves beans, right? Maybe you don't like chickpeas like this, you don't like to just eat them like this in a salad or whatever, but we can really transform them into something like a falafel. And you can do this with any kind of bean, really. You can make, black bean burgers. You see, that's essentially the same kind of idea, is that we're pureeing those black beans as the base of a patty, right? And technically with these falafel, you can make them like a falafel burger. You can make them as big as you want and have it be like a falafel patty, a falafel burger. So this is a really great way to get some more beans in. So much nutrient benefit from beans, and especially if you are vegetarian or vegan, beans are going to be a super staple for that plant-based source of protein. So the first ingredient we're using is the canned chickpeas. Then we have our seasonings, our spices. So we have just salt and pepper, and the other spice that we're using here is ground cumin. So ground cumin is used really in like Mexican cuisine, but then also in more Middle Eastern cuisine, which is where the falafel comes into play. So cumin's going to be the real, flavor maker here. And these salt, pepper, of course, is a staple. And then I always recommend having a well-stocked spice rack. So cumin is something that I use all the time, like I said, because it can go in different kinds of dishes, Mexican dishes, which I'm always doing some sort of like taco or enchilada kind of night during the week, and it works in Middle Eastern kind of dishes as well. So just, my favorite spices are not necessarily your favorite spices, but you decide and you keep your spice rack well stocked with spices that you can always add into things. And spices are just a quick, easy way to add flavor to any dish. So talking about something like beans right out of the can are pretty tasteless. Beans don't have that much flavor on their own. So adding a bunch of spices to something, say you're making like a vegetarian taco night and you're using black beans as the base, you can saute up those beans with a bunch of different kinds of taco spices like chili powder, cumin, smoked paprika, garlic powder, right? You can add a bunch of different spices in and still get that like taco flavor, even though you're eating beans instead of meat. So having a well-stocked spice rack is for sure something that I consider to be a staple when we're talking about keeping your kitchen well-stocked. Okay, and then we will have the zest of 1 lemon. So again, this is what I was saying, that it's not just about having your dry goods well stocked, but it's also about having some fresh ingredients on hand. And to me, these staples for fresh produce is onions, garlic, shallots, lemons, and limes are like the essential fresh produce to have. Like I said before, onions, garlic, and shallot last for a while. So you don't have to worry about them spoiling if you don't use them within a few days of buying them. So you can keep a few of each, keep them stocked up a few at a time so that you have those to rely on. They add a ton of flavor to any dish. And then same with lemons and limes. They'll last for a while, especially once they go in the fridge. And adding a squeeze of fresh lemon or lime juice to something, adding the zest, which is what we're going to do with the falafel. Again, it just adds a lot of flavor to something. So definitely I recommend always having the lemons and limes on hand as well. So far this is all stuff that I just had in my kitchen. I hadn't planned too far ahead to make the falafel. I intentionally wanted to do something where I could just gather ingredients that I happen to have on hand. So this is all just stuff that I always have, that I always have stocked up. And all of this information I have in a pantry essentials guide that goes, you got a pantry essentials guide and a kitchen essentials guide. So like all the equipment, tools, and utensils I mentioned before. So I can leave a link here if you want to access that guide, and that will kind of it just guides you through what I recommend. But again, like I said, it's you choosing what your favorites are. So when it comes to spices, choosing your favorite spices. When it comes to having you always want to have some of your favorite condiments on hand, your favorite toppings, your favorite sauces, things like that you can always jazz up a meal with a quick drizzle of your favorite sauce. right? I always say that I'd rather you eat a salad that's covered in your favorite dressing than not eat the salad at all, right? I'd rather you get your greens in some way, even if it means that they're covered in dressing, you know, whatever it is. I'd rather you eat something that, you know, eat it in a way that you actually enjoy it, rather than forcing yourself to eat a bowl of salad that you don't like, because that's never gonna last, right? We shouldn't have to live a life of eating food that we don't like. The other main ingredients here is a shallot. So I already cut this guy in half, but it's just one small shallot. And then I have here also 2 cloves of garlic. So like I just said, I always have shallots and garlic on hand, and yellow onion, red onion, always have that kind of stuff around. Then we're also going to have just a 1/4 cup of flour that's going to go into our falafel mix to kind of bind it together. So again, flour is a dry good, always have it around. So really the only fresh ingredient I'm using that I wouldn't just have lying around unless I bought it is fresh cilantro. So I have it just sitting here. I washed it, so it's just drying on a paper towel. The recipe actually calls for fresh parsley and fresh cilantro, but I only had fresh cilantro on hand, so we're just skipping the parsley this time around. And that's something too to kind of note, is no recipe is really set in stone unless it's a very specific, like it's a souffle, like it's a very specific kind of recipe that you need to follow to a T. Something like this where, you know, it calls for fresh parsley and fresh cilantro, you don't need to feel like, you know, I often see people just kind of like never trying a recipe, just like, that one's not for me, because it has an ingredient that they don't like. A lot of people are very averse to cilantro. So if you wanted to just use parsley in this recipe and skip the cilantro, you could do that. So just always keep that in mind with recipes, especially with cooking. It's a little bit different with baking, but definitely with savory cooking, you can usually make simple tweaks to recipes, and oftentimes omitting a certain ingredient like a spice or an herb, something like that. It's something that's just adding a certain flavor. And if you don't like that flavor, you can usually just omit that ingredient. Okay, so that's it for the ingredients. So you can see how really this comes together with just a few main ingredients, and they're all staples. So it's a great weeknight dinner, a quick dinner if you didn't have any, you know, if you didn't really have a plan, but you can say, you know, oh, I know I have chickpeas in the pantry and I have a shallot still left over. Like, you can kind of figure out that you can assemble this into a falafel and have a quick weeknight dinner. So this all comes together in the food processor. So I have my food processor here. So all we need to do is, I'm just gonna roughly chop the shallot and the garlic. We don't need to get them, you know, super chopped up because it's all going in the food processor. But I like to chop them up a little bit just so that you don't end up with chunks that don't really get fully, you know, fully mashed up in the food processor. So that's good for the garlic. Just cutting off the ends of the shallot here. And also, like I was talking about, you know, switching some things out in recipes. If you didn't have shallot on hand, but you have onion on hand, you could use an onion in this instead of shallot. You just, of course, would not want to use, the recipe I actually write it as, it's a 1/4 cup of shallot that you need. So you could certainly substitute with a 1/4 cup of chopped onion. All right, so that's all we need for that, just nice roughly chopped. And let's pull the food processor. All right, so into the food processor goes our whole can of chickpeas, our garlic and shallot, we're going to add in a teaspoon of salt and a teaspoon of the ground cumin. Okay, we're going to add a nice pinch of black pepper. And then the zest of 1 lemon. So I use a microplane for zesting. So like I was saying, with having, you know, the kitchen tools and equipment and utensils on hand, for something like zesting a lemon, having the right tool can make it so much easier and not be like, you know, if you see like the zest of a lemon in a recipe and you're like, oh, like now I have to zest the lemon, like it's a pain. Having the right tool on hand will make that a lot easier. So I definitely recommend a microplane for zesting. It's also good for grating when you need, you know, things grated small. So it has multiple uses. It's not like you'd be buying a microplane simply for the times that you're zesting, but it will make life easier. Another kind of hack or way that you can zest a lemon is to use a vegetable peeler. The pieces will come off bigger, of course. They'll come off like, you know, like a peel, but then you can chop up the peel very fine to make it kind of, you know, to make it fine like the zest that comes off the microplane. But again, it's like an extra step that you have to take. Okay, and we haven't done zests in a while, but remember with zesting, once you see, you know, once you're getting to that whitish part, that's where you want to stop, and you don't want to go too much deeper than that because it will start to get a bitter flavor. So we just want that surface zest. And so the zest here is just going to really, it's going to really just like brighten up the falafel. It's going to brighten up the flavor, which is nice, especially because, you know, it is a dish that's being made from mostly, you know, it's being made mostly from canned chickpeas. You know, it's a lot of dry kind of ingredients, so we want to kind of liven it up a bit. And that's what the lemon zest is, that fresh element that really kind of brightens up the flavor of that a little. Okay, and then our cilantro. Oops. Also, the nice thing about putting everything in the food processor like this is you don't have to worry so much when you're using like parsley or cilantro that have very delicate stems. The stems can go in here and they'll just, you know, they'll get blended up with everything. So you don't have to be so meticulous about avoiding the stems. They can definitely go in here and they'll just get blended up too. All right, so we want the recipe calls for 1/2 cup of fresh parsley and 1/2 cup of fresh cilantro. Like I said, I don't have parsley, so I'm just using cilantro. Okay, that should be good. All right, plug this guy in. So we're going to blend it before adding in the flour, because we might not need to use all the flour. I have a 1/4 cup here. The flour is really just to be that binding that holds the falafels together. So we'll kind of add it in slowly until it kind of forms like a dough where it's, you know, where it's not crumbly and it's holding together better. Okay. The nice thing about something like falafel also is that it's all totally cooked, right? So you can taste it before you actually cook them, taste the batter, make sure it's seasoned well enough. Okay. Stop it a couple times just to scrape down the sides, make sure everything gets nice and blend it up. All right, I'm gonna add, at this point, I'm gonna add like half the flour just to start blending it in. Oh, I see. No tahini in falafel. No, I don't put tahini in the falafel, but tahini is a really good dip for the falafel. Tahini I put in hummus. I put tahini in homemade hummus, but not in the falafel, but definitely as a dip. Let's see. All right, I'm gonna add a little bit more of the flour in, but I don't think I need all of it. Okay. All right, one more zap in the food processor. So that's it for that. So the whole batter for the falafel is done. I'm going to dump it out into a bowl just so we can give it a mix. And I'll show you the dough here. Okay. It's not really dough. It's really like a batter. So you can see it's all holding together nicely, so it's not crumbly. So I used about 3 tablespoons of flour here. Great, and that's all we're looking for. So if you were just making this and not talking a bunch like I am, you could see how this would come together nice and quickly. And all that's left to do now is cook them. So I'm actually going to set this in the fridge just for like 30 minutes before I cook them. It just helps to, it helps the batter to kind of hold together even better before you cook them up. And so you can cook these by frying, which is more traditional. I mean, the traditional way is to deep fry them, right? To submerge them in oil. So the 2 ways that I recommend trying is you can bake them. They don't come out as crispy, but you can bake them. And it's you definitely will use less oil that way. But I think they come out better when they're cooked in the frying pan. And we want to use a healthy, high heat cooking oil for this. So I think I talked about this a bit with the latkes because it's the same kind of idea that we're frying. And something like extra virgin olive oil does not hold up well to high heat, so your oil will start to burn before your falafel are done cooking. And we don't want oil to burn. It will add a bad taste to your food and it becomes rancid. We don't want that, right? It can be bad for our health. So we want to get a high heat cooking oil. So I have 2 options here. I have avocado oil, which of course is the oil of avocados. We know avocados are a good source of healthy fat, so that's what this avocado oil is. It is a little bit pricey, so another option is to get something like safflower seed oil. That's another good high heat cooking oil. That's also neutral in flavor, so that's important too, so that the oil is not imparting flavor into your falafels. Another option would just be to use canola oil. That will work also. So that's the way that I recommend cooking them. That's how I'll be cooking them, and I can take a little video when I fry them up, so I'll show you. But we just want, you want like a 1/4 cup of olive oil in the pan so that there's a nice little pool of oil, but so that the falafel aren't submerged, right? So we're talking pan frying instead of deep frying. So deep frying, they're submerged in the oil. The pan frying, they're just laying in a nice little pool of oil, but they're not submerged. So we're using a lot less oil that way, but we're able to get that really nice crispy texture on them. And if you're using a nice, a nice healthy oil like one of these, and you're getting healthy fat, right? It's not something that we don't need to always be, too worried about having too much fat when it's a good healthy fat. And there's not really any, let's see, what did we use? There's no fat, right? There's no fat in the falafel themselves. So we're getting all of that from the oil that we're cooking them in. So, like I said, you can make them as big or as small as you want. You can make them like falafel burgers and make them like patties, or just make them like little small falafel balls. And I'll serve them up in a pita with some feta cheese. We have some tomato and cucumber. So it will all be delish. What about baking them? Yes, you can bake them. You bake them at 375 for like 25-ish minutes. I would flip them halfway through so that they can get crispy on both sides, and definitely either drizzle oil over them, like drizzle olive oil or one of these oils over them, or just spray them with olive oil spray or something so that they do get a little bit crispy in the oven. If you don't put any oil on them at all, they won't crisp up, and the texture won't be probably what you want. So definitely, baking definitely is an option as well. Also, frying them, they only need like a few minutes on each side because it's not raw, right? It's not uncooked, so it's just a matter of getting that crispy texture on them. So they do cook up faster when you cook them in the pan too, but baking is definitely an option. All right, so I hope this gave you a new idea of what to do with some staple foods, some pantry ingredients. Like I said, this is a fun way to explore using other beans too. So trying something like a black bean burger. You can puree beans into dips and, try something other than hummus, try like a white bean dip or a black bean dip. So there's a lot of different ways that you can start to try beans in new ways and put all of those kinds of staple ingredients to use.